See, I'm one of those people only familiar with the film. I'm gonna have to go look for it.
Nope. Awkward silence.
Hello, humans. My name is Dael Kingsmill, and aren't I lucky? Today I have a guest with me. It's Justin Alexander from the
Hello.
Alexandrian. Woo!
I feel like I'm the lucky one. I'm here with Dale, so I
Oh,
can't
no, no,
can't have a
no,
better
no,
evening than
no.
this.
For people who don't know, Justin runs a fantastic blog called the Alexandrian, which, by the way, I don't know whether I've ever fully expressed. You know, when people say if you're going to homebrew something, check the DM's guide first. I've never and will never check the DM's guide. I check your blog.
Aw, thank you so much.
And now you're releasing a book, and I'm
I
going to have an
am.
actual book to go to.
Yeah, this is the new book to take a peek at when you want to when you're looking for the thing to find your answers in. That's really what the book is designed to do. It's designed to be the GM's survival guide. Like you're out in the wild with your players and something happens and you need a solution. This book is designed to give you that solution, to give you that security blanket, to know you have the information that you need.
It's called So You Want to Be a Game Master. I just thought that we should take advantage of the book's imminent release to have a chat. And I thought, why not do an Appendix N? This is my series is such a strong word, but it's I want to make it into a series where I talk to other creators about just the stuff that inspires them and inspired them early on to start getting into, I don't know, fantasy, sci-fi, genre, tabletop RPGs in general. If that sounds
I'm
good.
super excited about this. I love this concept of diving into the sort of appendix and these points of inspiration.
I thought we could use your contents page because you've divided the book into these handy chapters that cover different kind of styles of play and almost genres of play at the same time. You've got dungeons, mysteries, raids and heists, urban adventures, into the wild. How perfect. So first of all, dungeons. The idea, for me, dungeons calls to mind very classic fantasy. You know, even if we do look at Lord of the Rings, the Mines of Moria feels very, The Hobbit, big
Hmm.
one for me, you know, Goblin Town. You've got this real dungeon delving vibe. And of course, we know how much Lord of the Rings influenced tabletop RPGs as they
Well,
currently stand.
I'm hardly the only person who's going to tell you that like Tolkien is a major influence. I tend to like I think there's kind of like three camps. One of those camps is like Lord of the Rings only. One of those camps is like Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit is the most important thing. And the other camp is Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion is the biggest influence on them as a gamer. And I think, or as a creator. And I think for me personally, over time, it's kind of shifted. But I think as a game master, I'm probably most influenced by Lord of the Rings shading into Silmarillion. I love the way in which Tolkien builds up the legendary and the history of his world and then incorporates sort of all those amazing legends that he had built up in the Silmarillion into the narrative of the Lord of the Rings. I'm not saying anything new there, but I think it's a really cool way of thinking about things as a game master in terms of how you create things and then think about how you can bring all of that into the player's experience, not in big dumps of information per se, but in terms of evoking something greater and more wondrous, and then slowly you can explore and discover those things as you explore and discover the world.
Absolutely. Do you have, okay, well, now let's get a little trickier. What's like the earliest sort of fantasy text that you remember being introduced to?
That is a really great question. My parents were both big geeks themselves, so the whole time I was growing up, there was actually a section of our library at home that was filled with all kinds of fantasy and science fiction books. So it's difficult for me to kind of put my thumb on what the first thing would have been. I do have a memory of my mother reading the Narnia books by C.S. Lewis, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And of those also, of those seven books, the two strongest ones in my memory for a long time were The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, um, for obvious reasons. But also the sixth book in the original numbering, The Magician's Nephew. And that image of the world between worlds with all the pools where you could choose which world to jump into, such a powerful image that still really resonates with me to this day in terms of that ability. Both in terms of like the fictional reality of that being a cool place to go and explore, but also like as a game master, as someone who enjoys all of these different worlds and fantasies that on my own personal level, like looking into my library or looking into what game am I going to run next or what adventure am I going to run next, it's very much being in that wood with all of those pools and choosing which one am I going to jump into and discover next.
Oh yeah, and Magician's Nephew as well. Just so much wonderful imagery that has certainly stuck with me throughout the years. You know, the world between worlds is of course the big one, but even beyond that, things like there's the world they go to where they awaken Jadis, who becomes
Mm-hmm.
the White Witch. You know, that bell that they ring has just, the image is cemented in my brain. The image of the piece of iron she rips from a lamppost and throws it at Aslan, and it embeds itself. Spoilers?
Right,
Question
spoilers.
mark?
I mean, this is actually, I mean, okay, like this, you've unleashed a minor rant. I will try to contain myself. This is actually where,
Please.
like, so, as some people know, they renumber the Narnia books to put them in internal chronological order. And this is something I actually feel really passionate about, which is that, no, that's not the way to read them. You should start with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and The Magician's Nephew should be one of the last ones that you read, because it's revealing the backstory of all these mysteries that you've experienced through the course of the series. And if you haven't experienced those mysteries yet, the solution isn't as interesting, and you're also diminishing all of the mysteries. Which I think is another great lesson for game masters, is in terms of like, how do you pace those revelations? How do you sequence the information that your players get in order to maximize the payoff, to get them maximally interested in the enigmas that you're creating, and then pay those enigmas off with the revelations of what's really going on.
Yes. I think for me, because again, the Narnia books, huge influence when I was very young. Now that you've mentioned it, I just realized The Horse and His Boy for a really long time was my favorite, because of this weird detachment from the rest of the story, where it's like, here are characters not from our world, they're from the world of Narnia, and they're going on their adventure. And Susan makes a brief appearance, and she's just so different from what you remember. And it was very scary at times. The tombs,
I just I'm actually in the middle of reading the Narnia books to my daughter for the first time. She just turned 7, and we've been reading through the books for the first time. When she was
perfect age.
younger, I read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe to her, and then we tried reading Prince Caspian. And she's like, no, 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 read me The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe again. So I read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe to her like 6 times. And now, finally, she's like, no, I'm getting it now with the books beyond that. So we've been reading through the series. So I'm actually right in the middle of Horse and His Boy with her right now. And literally last night, we got to the point where Shasta meets Queen Susan and King Edmund in Tashbaan. And I read that and I go, do you know who Queen Susan and Prince Edmund are? And she's like, who? And I'm like, they're the kids from the first book. And she went, she was just blown away. And then like we spent like 5 minutes talking about, but I don't, like, the last book was like 1,000 years in the future. How is this one in the past? And like she was just completely blown away by that crossover.
So nice. Oh, my heart is filled with wonder again. I remember what it was like. Are there any things, and I say things because I feel like text implies book, but I of course mean, I don't know, art, film, music, anything like that. But are there things that you can remember experiencing when too young is such a bizarre phrase, right? Like, but I mean things that were more mature maybe than your age when you first experienced them, whether that mean that they're scary or just sophisticated, or I don't know.
I do very distinctly remember when I was a young kid, I had a fascination with the Titanic, the story of the Titanic sinking. And I used to bike around the neighborhood and go to garage sales in the summer. And I went to a garage sale, and they had a table full of books. And one of those books, I think it was either 25 cents or 50 cents or whatever, was a book called Raise the Titanic by Clive Cussler. And I was like, this looks amazing because it's the Titanic. And the whole concept is that like they're going to raise the Titanic back to the surface. And so I bought this book for 50 cents, and I take it home and read it. Well, most people don't remember Raise the Titanic, or even necessarily Clive Cussler these days. I don't know if he was ever actually big in Australia, but he's like a techno thriller spy writer. Clive Cussler is bizarrely a member of like the NOAA in the U.S., which is like a scientist who study the ocean. And for some reason, this always gets him involved in spy stuff. It's the most bizarre, it's a whole series of books. It's a bizarre thing. This book was way beyond what I, as a second grader at the time, should have been reading. It was a 400-page thick spy novel with all of the spy conceits. Like there's a scene There's a scene in the book where like the bad guys like torture the good guy cis white heroes by having like the girl begin to strip, and it's so scandalous they have to give up the top secret information. And I'm a second grader reading this, being like, interesting. I don't understand. And so in terms of like the what did you read when you were way out of your league, that's the one. And the other thing about it that really sticks with me is years later is that book, like 300 pages or whatever it was, took me like 2 months to read through. Like it was my first big chapter book.
You were
I was
dedicated.
Really I was grinding. I was like, partly at the time I had this thing like, if you start a book, you got to finish it. So I was just grinding my way through this book. But I remember I finished that book and I was like, well, I like this. I'll go find more Clive Cussler books. And then I remember, but as soon as I finished that book, the next book I finished in like a fraction of the time. Like that book was this big hurdle for me figuring out mentally how to read chapter books at speed.
Whoa.
So the only thing about that is like my mom kind of like was wondering what these like Clive Cussler books were, and she was becoming concerned about them. And she told me years later that she stopped worrying about it when I picked up when I brought like the third or fourth book I read, and I was like, I brought it and I was like, Mom, these books are kind of like repetitive. Like I can tell exactly what's going to happen on such and such a page. They're going to like have the girl take her clothes off, and this one's ridiculous because like it's a whole dream sequence. Like it's just like he had to write a scene with the girls taking their clothes off. And my mom was like, okay, well, that's disturbing, but if he's textually analyzing it and figuring out that it's not actually like good, he's probably fine. It's probably fine.
So much media awareness.
Yeah.
At such a young age. That's beautiful. And you know what else? It dovetails into part 2, mysteries. Hey!
There we go.
Your node-based, your 5-node mystery system is a lifesaver.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that, because it's certainly something that was a lifesaver for me, which is why I really wanted to share it out there with the world.
Let's talk about mysteries. So we've already got a spy novel in the mix. What would you say are your like biggest mystery genre influences?
Well, I'll start by mentioning like a fantasy mystery that I think is really that influences me a lot these days. Is a series called the Vlad Taltosh books by Stephen Brust. They go in a lot of different places. They start out as an urban fantasy adventure with this sort of criminal boss who keeps dealing with like mysteries he has to kind of solve as sort of a mafia boss, a fantasy mafia boss. The main character is this human who lives in this empire full of like draconic, long-lived immortals, and so he has this also like minority perspective and kind of an interesting look on things like that. The series goes very different places, but particularly those early Vlad Taltosh books, I think has a very large influence on me, both for mysteries and also just sort of the way I think about urban adventures these days as well. I will be remiss not to say that probably the most significant mysteries in my life is actually my mother was a published mystery author under the name Margaret Fraser. And so she wrote a historical mystery set in the 1400s in a nunnery, and then in her second series, it was a medieval actor in a theater troupe who would tour around England in the 14th century, who becomes a spy because he's turning around and can get his ears in places, and therefore begins solving mysteries around medieval Europe.
This is amazing.
So I would be remiss not to hype my mother's books when given the opportunity to talk about mysteries.
All right, now patented difficult question. If you had to pick like one scene from each of those book series that like stands out in your memory as like, boom, here's like a moment that stuck with me, what would you pick?
From the Vlad Taltosh series, there is a scene in one of the early books where Vlad Taltosh has these sort of very powerful wizard friends, patrons of a kind, which gives him a certain leverage because he has connections with these people. And he has to go to them and ask them to do something which will transform his relationship with them. He will probably lose their patronage as a result. So it's a big sacrifice for him, but he has to do it. And so it's a very intense scene between the two of them. And I really just have this... the thing about that powerful image, right? It's just one thing, and it's him standing in this ornate room at the wizard's castle, where they've gone aside from this party to talk amongst themselves, and just something about that really stuck with me. And like, it's a scene that I don't necessarily try to capture that specific scene, but I try to capture that feel in a lot of my gaming, where it is these powerful factions, these powerful competing interests in a small room where the PCs have access, where the players have access, and what do you do with that access? What are the choices you make with that access to power? So that's a very powerful scene for me.
Heck yeah.
In my mother's books, that's a little like choosing one of my babies. One of my mother's babies. I don't know. That analogy may not actually hold together. But there is a very powerful scene, and it is spoilerific. So I'm going to keep it a little bit general. But at the end of the second book, The Servant's Tale, there is a moment where Sister Fravis, who's the main character, the detective in the series, thinks that she has solved the mystery and thinks that she has resolved the situation. And then there is this one thought that sort of flicks across her brain, like there's this little impetus, and it flicks across her brain, and it all clicks. And she realizes what the real solution is, and she realizes that someone's life is in terrible jeopardy, and she's too late. She's too late. And it is, biased as I am, it is one of the most heartbreaking scenes I've ever read, when she discovers just how late she is. And if she just had that thought 5 pages earlier, she could have saved someone's life. And that kind of consequence, that kind of tragedy, is really powerful and really resonates with me very strongly.
Love a little heartbreak, love a little bit of tragedy. It's the light and shade, right? That brings, I think, a lot of power, especially to storytelling, in any form. But, you know, I try to bring it to games where I can, because, you know, I've talked before, probably at length, and bored a lot of people about, you know, fantasy as a genre, and the sort of markers of fantasy as a genre, and where it differs from certain other genres, and how you can play with that, how you can shift the horizon of expectations, and bring delight by subverting those expectations. Bring a little bit of tragedy to your fantasy, and suddenly everything's much more real somehow. I think that it also goes to show there's a lot of understanding of genre that comes into your work, and how to apply that genre at the table, not just in terms of D&D. D&D is a great and simple place to describe those, because a lot of people are familiar with it. But if you look at this book, if you look at the 5-node mystery, if you look at, you know, overland travel, which we'll get to at some point, you know, all of these systems that you're talking about in this book, they don't just apply to D&D. Right? Like I immediately think of ways that I'm going to apply these when I'm looking at City of Mist, or Kids on Bikes, or, you know, any number of other games. And it's wonderful to see how your brain turns genre to system, and system to process, if that makes
That makes 100% sense. And that, I mean, yeah, it's exactly it. The way I've been thinking about designing adventures for a long time is in terms of scenario structure. That there are these structures of how certain types of stories work, and that applies even like dungeons, right? Like I use the term dungeons, but it's really, we can also refer to those as location crawls. And I've used location crawl structures for everything from like you know, runs in Shadowrun or Cyberpunk 2077 to the Burrow of Mice in Mouse Guard, for example. There's just such a breadth you can do with these structures, and it's something I really kind of embrace in the book. Like you say, we have this lingua franca of Dungeons and Dragons that is where most people are going to start out, because it's not people are, oh, it's like the elephant in the room. No, it's more like, I don't know, like it's not even the blue whale in the room. It's like it is the moon. It is the moon. It's the moon in the room, and yeah, it is the room. Yeah, and so, but the book starts out, and I had a challenge writing the book, which was some of the people picking up this book will have never played a role-playing game before. So the first thing I do is I'm like, hey, look, if you saw this, you're like, ooh, you know, I've wanted to try out this role-playing game thing. Maybe this is the place to start. I have like a 5 or 6 page intro where I'm like, okay, here's the very basic introduction. And I do break the news to them, though, that this is not actually a role-playing game. This is a book about role-playing games, so you will have to go and find a role-playing game to actually play it. But then the next thing I do is I say, okay, let's talk about how we can get you to the table and running your game as quickly as possible. And I say, okay, I think the structure to start with is, in fact, dungeons. And one of the reasons I think dungeons are really great for first-time game masters is because they are They are firewalled. Each room in the dungeon is firewalled from the rest of the adventure. So you don't have to think about everything that's happening in the whole adventure the way you often do with some of the other types of stories, like mysteries, for example. You can just focus on the one room. And that's a lot easier to kind of get your hands around as a first-time GM. So I say, okay, so if we're going to run a dungeon as your first adventure, what do you need? What do you actually need to run that adventure? And I say there's 2 skills that you need. And one of them is how to make a ruling, which is like the basic skill for all game mastering. The players say they want to do something. How do you respond to that? How do you make a ruling on what happens when they say they want to go to the corner store or jump over a chasm or, you know, attack the goblin, whatever it may be? How do you make that ruling? And then the second skill you need is how to run a room, because in a dungeon, you have rooms, and if you know how to interpret the information in the room key and use that information to make rulings, you know how to run a dungeon. So if you have those 2 skills, you can run your first dungeon. And so that's the first thing that happens in the book. Here are your 2 skills. Here's a dungeon. Put my book down. Go run the adventure. So like 45, 50 pages into the book, I'm like, great. You've been here for like an hour maybe. Put the book down, go and run the adventure, then come back, because you're going to learn a lot at the table.
The lesson and homework structure.
Yes, very much so. Like, I think, you know, it's a big chunky book, but it's designed to like actually be used as you go through it. So anyways, long story short, the dungeon section is there. In the dungeon section, I kind of assume that people are going to be playing or running Dungeons and Dragons, because that's overwhelmingly likely. And also, I didn't want to like choke up the beginning of the book by being like, well, if you're running this game, you can do this, and if it's this game, you can do that, and if you're in a cyberpunk setting, you can do that. It's just too much for a first-time GM. It's too many extra things to juggle. So I kind of keep that focus. And actually, in that first section, I use the term dungeon master for that section. But then once we're done with dungeons, at the end of that section, I say, look, now that you've run probably several adventures, designed your first adventure here, here's the rest of the book, and you get to kind of choose what type of story you want to tell next, what type of scenario you want to design next, whether it's a mystery, a raid, a heist, and so forth. And so I give a list, and I say, or of course you can keep reading through the book cover to cover. But from that point forward, I actually stop using the term dungeon master and go back to using the term game master. And the reason for that is because from that point forward, I really want to make sure that now that you have some experience under your belt, I can begin talking a bit more about different options, different genres, different games that you can be playing and using these tools with. There's a lot of great GM advice out there in a lot of different forms. And a lot of it takes the form of like, kind of like high-level stuff. You'll get advice like, listen to your players. Well, yes, absolutely, that's good advice. I'm not saying that's not good advice. But for someone who's just trying to figure out, what do I actually do at the table? What do I actually design before I go to the table? That's not really useful. It's not useful advice in the sense that it's not actionable. And I had a very strong image going into this project that being a GM doesn't have to be as mysterious and arcane and like a ooh kind of like it's a mystery, go there and see what happens thing where you have to like cross the veil to figure it out. There's actually is like a specific set of step-by-step guides for running a dungeon. This is what you prep. This is how you use it at the table. You're a game master. This is how you prep a mystery. These are the things you do to prep the mystery. These are the specific types of things you prep. And here's how you use the things that you prepped at the table, and you're going to have a successful, robust mystery experience that doesn't fall apart, doesn't break, and doesn't overwhelm you when you actually want to share that mystery with your players.
Do you have other games that you constantly go back to and think about mechanically in terms of inspirations when you're, I don't know, systemizing your own play at the table, regardless of what game it might be?
Yeah, like, and I think everyone who has been in the hobby for a while probably has like their own personal story of like systems that have influenced them over the years. Most recently, I'd say some of the biggest influences are probably Blades in the Dark has been a very big influence lately. One of the things I love about Blades in the Dark is that John Harper has a very similar approach to thinking about the structures of play, and Blades in the Dark really bakes those in. It bakes it in the sense that like you have this very strong downtime structure, this very strong structure for running jobs or heists, and this very strong structure for how to build your crew in the game, your crew of criminals that you're running. And because he thinks in those terms, all of those different structures hook into each other and hook into the mechanics of the game. This is actually something we talked about previously, like that when you have mechanics that aren't tethered to a scenario structure, you end up with mechanics that don't get used because they kind of just float free. And if you look at like the history of D&D, for example, you have this whole history of people designing supplements about being on a ship, for example. There'll be all these rules about like the hit points for the ship, or like how long it takes to travel from one place to another. You'll have just these huge books, and every few years somebody else is like, I'm going to do it. I'm going to write the ship book for D&D. And then those books come out and nobody really uses any of the mechanics in them, and it's because none of those mechanics are actually hooked into a scenario structure that lets you design and run scenarios that make any of those mechanics or ship life relevant to the story, to the session.
And again, leads us straight into the next section: raids and heists. Possibly, I mean, mysteries is up there for me, but raids and heists, possibly my favorite chapter of the book, because I of course, like many other people, found your blog through the Dragon Heist remix, and so this is a big one for me. I just want to run some good heists.
Yeah, and I think too,
service.
You're very welcome. I think yeah, like, and the other thing too I talk about in the book is like, once you know how to run a raid or a heist, it becomes an incredibly useful structure particularly in terms of games where you are responding to things that players want to do. There's so many experience, and this is really what the book is trying to get away from, this idea that like the way you prep an adventure is to prep the plot of things that your players are going to do. And it's much more about prepping toys that you can play with your players. And when you get into those kinds of games, you'll often end up in situations where the PCs will want something. They'll want an item, or they'll want to like kill somebody who's been pissing them off, whatever that might be. They'll have some goal that they have. And the great thing about a raid or a heist scenario is all you have to do is take whatever the players already said they were interested in, a magic item, the person they want to kill, put it in a secured location, and then you can run a raid or a heist. It becomes a very flexible scenario structure for responding to player wants, because you just take the want and you put it behind some defenses, and then you say, what are you going to do about it? And then they tell you what they're going to do about it.
Oh yeah, my current game, the thing that they want is they want to question a corpse in the morgue at the Central Police Precinct. So that's, I guess, what I'm reaching for. I'm reaching for the heist rules. What's your favorite heist text?
My overall favorite heist story is probably the 90s remake of the Thomas Crown Affair, starring Pierce Brosnan and Rene Russo.
Yes.
I love that movie so much. I've watched it so many times and I love it so much. It doesn't have a huge influence on my gaming per se, because the way that story is structured is a lot more about the characters than about the structure of the actual heists. So the thing that probably influences me most when I'm thinking about like what does an ideal heist look like is probably actually another remake of a 1960s movie. It's the Ocean's 11 remake with George Clooney and Brad Pitt and everybody else in the universe in it.
Well, isn't that an interesting difference though? The idea that you can have a favorite example of a genre piece, but that's different necessarily from the touchstones of that genre, or the things that make up your, I call it like your palette that you paint your campaign with.
Yeah, the thing is, like, it actually is tricky too, because like when we talk about like what inspires structures and how these stories work at the game table, it can be difficult to build that palette because everything else you experience in terms of media, films, books, comic books, whatever the case may be, those are all linear narratives where the writer has prepared a plot. They've prepared the things that happen and they describe those things to you. And that's really not the way that role-playing games work on a fundamental level. At a fundamental level, you go to the table and the players tell you what they're going to do. And you can try and force them to do the thing that you prepped, but it's a lot easier, of course, to just not have tried to prep something for them to do and instead prep things for them to interact with. The Thomas Crown Affair is a fantastic movie, but in terms of the lessons it can teach me at the gaming table, it doesn't really do that. But there are lessons I can take from other things that may be more applicable.
Speaking of the nuance between different genre texts and which ones are helpful, which ones aren't, raids and heists, all right, please, I would love to hear your sort of pitch for what is the difference between a raid and a heist.
Right. So this is a little idiosyncratic. I needed to discuss the difference between these two different structures. The ways in which I use the words are not meant to be representative of like wider genres by any stretch of the imagination. But in terms of the structural difference between what I call a raid scenario structure and a heist scenario structure, in a raid scenario, well, actually, let's go one step back, because these are all kind of location-based adventures, and so are dungeons. So if you are in a dungeon, if you're in a dungeon structure, the expectation of play is that you know that the players will know nothing about the structure of the dungeon, the layout of the dungeon, who's in there really beyond maybe some broad strokes like there's goblins in that there castle, what the defenses are. They won't know any of that as they enter the dungeon. The expectation is that they will discover those things by exploring the location. So the distinction between a dungeon and a raid as a location-based adventure is that in the raid, the expectation is that you roll up on a location and you can quickly survey it and learn the layout, the defenses, the people who are there, and so that you can then plan how you're going to attack that location strategically. Like a classic example for me in a lot of games is you come up and you know the bad guys are in that house over there or that compound over there, and you can post up on a hill or like sit in the alley across the street and you can put eyes on it and you can figure out, okay, well, the entrances are here, here, and here. We can get a pretty good sense of like where the rooms in the building are. We know like there's 2 guards on the front door. We see the security cameras, etc. You may not know like 100% of it, but you can very quickly like just look at the location, do a survey of it, and know those details so that you can then plan your raid. So that's a raid. The big difference between a raid and a heist is that the target of the heist is such that you cannot just quickly survey and look at the location and get that information. So the heist adds a whole extra step where you have to acquire that information in some way. And so that's kind of the progression for me, where you know nothing and you're exploring, to where you can quickly get the information you need, and then a heist where you have this extra step where you have to actually make an effort to like get blueprints or like question the guards or like whatever that research looks like to acquire that information.
We are doing our heists. Where would I like to do my heists most? Well, I think I would like to do it in an urban environment.
That's what we call a transition. I love it.
Oh, I've been learning from Ben Byrne on the Lorecast. Master of transition. Urban Adventures is the next chapter. We got to talk about it. What are your favorite not only urban fantasies, but also just kind of, I don't know, adventures in the city?
I'll start with sort of the extra RPG kind of stuff, which is one of the biggest influences for me for fantasy cities is Thieves' World, which was a anthology series edited by Robert Lynn Asprin and Lynn Abbey back in the 80s. It had 12 or 14 volumes in it, and it was each one of them was a short story collection where they had different fantasy authors of the time come in and write these short stories, but they were all set in this city of Sanctuary, this gritty fantasy city. And so it was this universe that had been built up by all of these different authors, and it was books that I found in my local library at the same time I was discovering D&D, so I really like early super influential influence on me. Another major influence for me in terms of thinking about fantasy urban settings would be War for the Oaks by Emma Bull, which is another 80s fantasy novel. This one is an urban fantasy set in well, it was the modern day, now it's 40 years ago, but modern day urban fantasy with the Fey elements. It's a girl who is involved in the rock and roll scene of the time, falling in with these Feyish creatures who are intruding on our reality. It'd be right up your alley, honestly, Dael. But it had a huge influence on me. It's really, really good. Had extra resonance for me because it's set in Minneapolis, which is where I live now, and at the time my mother lived there, and so it was like, oh, I know that place. But it has a huge influence on me in terms of like these Fey elements, this magical layer over an urban environment has a really, really big influence on me in terms of how I think about those things. What has had a massive impact on me in terms of my gaming in urban environments is the Tolis setting by Monty Cook, which was the setting that he was playtesting, because Monty Cook was the co-designer of D&D 3rd edition. He was playtesting D&D 3rd edition in this homebrew campaign setting, and then a few years later published it as this amazing book, which was then adapted recently to 5th edition and reprinted just, I think, a couple of years ago. And I've run a ton of games in the Tola setting. It's just this amazingly rich, well-designed city supplement where Cook does a really fantastic job of making everything on every page focused on how can this be used at the table. So it's this big chunky, I think like 600-page book, and every single page is just teeming with cool stuff to do at the table with it. So it's just a very rich experience. So that's had
Oh,
an outsized influence on how I think about urban adventures, just because I've run so many urban adventures there.
oh, hell yeah. Okay. When you look at the idea of an urban adventure and you look at, again, your sort of inspiration palette, I'm thinking about how city settings can run the gamut in vibe from something like Pratchett and Discworld all the way through to, I don't know, Jason Bourne, right? Like you've got such a broad range of feelings, for lack of a better word, that can be tied to the city. How do you make it feel like a city adventure when the actual tone is not necessarily the defining factor?
Well, and the urban adventure section is the first section of the book where there's like a bunch of different structures kind of put in there together you can use in different combinations. So one of the biggest tricks is when you're running adventures in a city, whether you're focusing on the city as the adventure, if the adventure is just happening in the city, is to make that city come to life and to communicate to the players what it feels like to live in that city. And so that's kind of the first place I start in the book, is I look at that. And again, it can be broken down as sort of a very basic procedure, which is, you want to have a map of the city so everyone can orient. One of my favorite techniques is to get a big enough map of whatever city it is, whether it's a real city or a fantastical city, and then put that up on the wall of my gaming room so that everyone in the room can see and reference that map of the city. It really helps bring the city to life. I actually will have a laser pointer behind my GM screen, so I can pop the laser pointer up and actually indicate, like, oh, you walk down this way through the city. You can actually pull them through the map onto those streets. So I love doing that. So you want to have that map. The way I generally approach these cities is I will break the city down into districts or neighborhoods, usually about a half dozen of those to start off, although we may break them up further if we spend more time in a particular city. And then those districts, I will actually stock up with, like, well, what do they look like in general? What are the major landmarks there? You don't need to do a lot, but you need to know, like, oh, this is what the docks look and smell like. This is what the Nobles District looks and smells like. And here are a couple of landmarks. And then the way that I will build the city up over time for the players is to not try and dump everything on them, to make it the experience of the city. So when you think about a city, you have a setting where pretty much everything the players do in a city can be described at a broad level as they are going from point A to point B. They'll be like, oh, we want to go raid the abandoned castle up on the hill, or we want to go find a hotel, or we want to go question Duke Dormond, or whatever the case may be. So whenever the players say, I want to go do this thing somewhere in the city, you look at where they are and you look at where they're going to, and you can follow a very simple procedure, which is to look at the path they follow, what districts would they go through, and describe that journey by landmark. And then the last element I'll do when I'm prepping a city that I'm going to spend a lot of time in is I'll prep random encounters for the city. And you can do a handful of those, or you can break them down by districts or whatever the case may be. But then when they take that journey, I will make a random encounter check so that on some of the journeys, at least, they will have some kind of encounter. And that doesn't mean a combat encounter. It can be like, oh, you see some people selling fish on the side of the street, or you see someone tries to pick your pocket, et cetera, et cetera. It's just these little bits of color. So as they move through the city, they begin learning the landmarks of the city. They begin learning what the different districts of the city feel like. And then they have these little bits of life from the city that intrudes onto them. Because I feel like what makes a city, as opposed to being in a wilderness, for example, is the fact that there is life all around you in a city. And that can be the biggest challenge to overcome and to capture at the table. But if you can have a structure where you can bring that life in at the appropriate moments and sort of build that up, it's also the rich opportunity of the city to be a unique experience at the table.
I feel like there's a lot to be learned from video games in this particular facet of gameplay at the table, because it makes me think of games like Assassin's Creed. And how do you take this video game that's like, your sandbox area, and it's not an infinite city, but you got to make it feel big, you got to make it feel populated. And how do you do that? Crowd it with people that you have to get around in the street without knocking them all over. And this person breathing fire during the Carnivale into the wild.
It can be very daunting. My own experience as a GM was The first published game that I played was the 1983 basic set by Frank Menzer for D&D. And then the next set in that was the expert set, which then introduced Wilderness. And I read the basic set and I understood how a dungeon worked, and I ran a lot of dungeons. And then I got the expert set, possibly for my birthday, got the expert set, and I was like, ooh, Wilderness. And I tried running Wilderness adventures, and I had no idea what I was doing, because I tried to run them like dungeons. I'd be like, okay, you're standing at the edge of the forest. What do you do? And they'd be like, we walk into the forest. I'd be like, okay, great. You go 20 feet into the forest, you pass some trees. There are more trees. What do you do? And it didn't work. So the sheer vast scale of the wilderness and how alien that can be to the firewall of the dungeon room can be very intimidating. I've experienced that myself. But much like the urban crawl chapter, the biggest thing I do in terms of Into the Wilderness is you really have to figure out, when you're talking about the wilderness, is what are the players doing there? A rookie mistake, if you will, is to think, oh, they're in the wilderness, therefore I have to run a hex crawl, because we've all kind of heard about hex crawls, right? Well, the truth is that a hex crawl is a very specific structure for running exploration campaigns in the wilderness, where you're going out and exploring kind of relatively unknown territory and like exploring it. And it's not a great system if the players are just traveling from point A to point B in the wilderness. So that's what I call route-based adventures. And in some cases, even if you're running exploration, a hex crawl may be overkill. A hex crawl really works best if you are exploring the same area over and over again, because when you design a hex crawl, you are filling a ton of content out onto the map and filling every hex to some extent. And unless the players are going to be going out and exploring over and over again, they're going to miss most of the stuff that you put on that map. And so it's not really a good use of your time to prep all that. So there are alternative structures that I also talk about in the book, which include point crawls, which are another way of sort of organizing the wilderness that gives you different strengths and advantages. So this is really the section of the book. It's the last scenario structure section of the book. So it's also the section where I'm like, you really want to start thinking about what scenario structures are you using and why are you using them. And then at the end, I give this launch pad of like, and point crawls are useful in the wilderness, but they can also be used in urban environments or the Underdark or planar adventures as a way of organizing navigation through kind of any scale of setting. And I'm going to challenge you as a reader to take this information about how to run wilderness point crawls and think about how you would design point crawls for another scenario, which could, could say all those things, or traveling through space, or all kinds of examples of things that you can use point crawls for.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is this this interesting difficulty, right, where we see a film like, I don't know, Fellowship of the Ring, or you watch Firefly, or I don't know, any story where they're traveling vast distances, and you get these beautiful sweeping vistas and these montages of things, and that can be very difficult to translate at the table.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have I don't know, either a text that you find is a really useful sort of traveling or exploration point of contact, like I'm talking about with heists, right? You know, is there a particular text that is a better fit for translating to the table? Or alternatively, do you have tips for translating something that is tricky?
Part of the trick that you run into, particularly with wilderness adventures and travel narratives, and getting inspiration from other media for that, is that part of the appeal of these vast travel narratives, like Firefly, for example, fantastic series, the whole motivation for Captain Reynolds is to explore the great unknown, right? To have freedom to go anywhere he wants to go. And that can be really challenging as a GM to capture that experience. But the reason why it can be difficult to like use media as your model for that is that in any linear medium that you're talking about, the books, the films, the graphic novels, there's only one path that the characters actually take. Like, they have a ton of options, but they only took one of them. And if you're looking for a basic tip about how to sort of tackle that as your first step into the wild, so to speak, it would be to take some guidance from that thought process. Let's take The Lord of the Rings, for example. So in The Lord of the Rings, Frodo gets all the way to Rivendell, and he's got the ring, and they have the Council of the Fellowship, where they all discuss everything they know, and they come up with a plan of action. At that council, they talk about all the different options that they could take. Like they could go this way, they could put the ring over there, they could try to flee west with it, they could do this, that. There's other options that they don't discuss. They don't discuss, hey, maybe we could get the Eagles, maybe we could sail a ship. Narratively speaking, they don't discuss all the options, which has become infamous in the case of the Eagles, for example. But like the beat there is we discuss our options and we choose one of them. Well, one of the ways that you can help yourself as a GM is to structure your session so that the players have that meeting and they decide where are we going to go, and importantly, how are we going to get there? And then you say, great, end of session, I'll see you guys next week. And then you can go prep the exact plan that they put in place. So that's one way you can kind of like take the entire world and boil it down. And so there's kind of two steps there. The first one is you need to know just enough about the world, like a map of the world, for example, and just enough details. You make, well, there's mountains here and an open plain here, but you might get spied on by the Crebain, or you could try and go north, but there's goblins there. If you know that degree, or you could go down by the river and the sea, but there's pirates who are loyal to Sauron sailing those seas. If you know those kinds of information, you have enough information to give the players that they can figure out what their plan's going to be. And that's a very high level, maybe like a page of information. You can prep that or even improvise that pretty easily. Then once they make that choice, hey, we're going to go south, you have a much narrower and more specific band that you can focus on as you prep along the path that they're going to go. So that's one way of kind of getting your hands around the infinite and pulling it down.
It made me think of a really eye-opening section of the wilderness chapter here, where you discuss, I won't go super in depth on it because I mean, go get the book, but but you talk about how to make the choice be a meaningful choice, how to give players information that makes it a choice, not a calculation. And that was a really, it was like you touched my forehead and I saw the universe in that moment, because I'd never really thought about it that way, because there is, you know, a certain point where just being like, which one's safer and which one is faster become the only choices that you put on the table, and those aren't the only valuable choices, and in fact often aren't valuable choices if it comes down to like which one's faster. If it doesn't matter when they arrive, that's not a real choice.
Well, I think, you know, I talk about in the book specifically, like you say, in the context of choosing between these routes in the wilderness. And so the key distinction here is that a choice is when you have competing interests that you need to choose between. A calculation is often when you only have one thing that you care about and you're just trying to figure out what is the best way to accomplish the thing that I want. So if you, like you say, if you have two different routes and the only difference between them is this one's faster and this one's slower, well, you're going to choose the faster one because obviously it's just better on the only metric that you have. But if one's faster but more dangerous and the other one is slower but safer and time is relevant, like they actually have to be things that are meaningful, then you have to make an actual choice. Is speed more important to you, or is safety more important to you? And the key concept there is this concept of an incomparable, that an incomparable is something that you can't directly say, well, safety just means more than speed. Maybe it does in this situation to you. Maybe someone else would make a different choice. They aren't directly comparable. You can't calculate the outcome. And that's where meaningful choices come from. So I talk about that in terms of this route, but it is an eye-opening moment when I discovered this concept, because it applies widely to all the choices that you make in a role-playing game. And thinking about the dilemmas that you present to the players, those dilemmas become meaningful when they have to make tough, meaningful choices about what is important to them and what are they willing to sacrifice to get the things that are important to them.
It really is. It's that bit from the Fellowship where, oh, we can't go this way because of the spies. We'll go through the mountain. Oh, everyone's going to freeze to death. Okay, well, how do we feel about this still? Let's go through Moria. Thank you so much for talking to me about these things. Are there any other really deep set inspirational Appendix N sources for you that you need to talk about now?
You know, I put on my list that I wanted to mention Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind by Hayao Miyazaki. It's a beautiful graphic novel series. A lot of people are familiar with the movie that he did, the animated film, but that was actually based on a graphic novel that he had started before he did the film and then finished after he did the film. So the film is like this one little tiny amazing narrow slice of this vast epic fantasy narrative, and it has everything that's wonderful about adventure and and fancy and whimsy and epic and awe and personal tragedy and all of it. So it's just a lovely narrative. I didn't have a chance to like squeeze it in here, but if anyone hasn't read that yet, they absolutely should seek that out.
My thing with the film for Norska is that I don't know whether this is not relevant at all, but I think of it every single time it comes up, is that every man in that film has a mustache except for love interest boy. So next time you're watching that film, keep an eye out. Thank you so much for speaking to me, Justin. I'm very excited for the release of the book. Congratulations. You've clearly put so much work into it. I think that it's a really cool thing that you've made.
Oh, thank you, Dael. I'm really glad you enjoy it, and hopefully everyone else will too, or at least find it useful. So
thank you so much. I don't remember what my outro is. Something about emailing it to your grandma. This is good. This is professional. It's good. It's solid. It's solid.
I love it. This is the best part for me.
This is something. Say what? Yeah, email your girl. I'll see you another time. I'll see you another time.
Thank you so much, Dael.
Oh, good.